Elizabeth Thorne sold a man's daughter to pay a gambling debt and told him the girl died of a fever. She expected her master Shoemaker to craft the perfect silk slippers for the governor's ball while he mourned a lie. She wanted to dance on the bones of a family she destroyed, wearing silver thread and fine leather. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that a man who spends 30 years working with a blade knows exactly how to make a cut that never heals. She thought she was getting a pair of shoes. What she was actually getting was a death sentence for her reputation and a physical reckoning that would leave her crawling on the floor of the most prestigious ballroom in South Carolina. The Thorne plantation wasn't the biggest in the county, but Elizabeth ran it like she was royalty. The air there always smelled of jasmine and rot. It's the kind of place where the porch is painted a pristine white, but the soil underneath is soaked in things people don't want to talk about. Zebulun lived in the silence of his workshop, a small wooden shack filled with the scent of cured hides and beeswax. He was 50 years old, with hands that looked like the bark of an old oak tree. He didn't talk much. He didn't have to. His work spoke for him. Every gentleman in the district wanted a pair of Zebulun's boots, and every lady craved his delicate evening slippers. He was the most valuable asset the Thorne estate had left, though Elizabeth treated him like a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Zebulun had one thing in this world that kept his heart beating: his daughter Zora. She was 14, bright-eyed, and worked in the main house. She was the only reason Zebulun kept his head down and his mouth shut. But 3 weeks ago, Zora vanished. Elizabeth Thorne walked down to the workshop with a lace handkerchief pressed to her nose and told Zebulun that the girl had been taken by a sudden, violent fever. She said they had to bury her quickly in the woods to stop the spread. No funeral, no goodbye, just a shallow grave and a cold lie. Look at how some people think they can buy and sell souls just to keep a fancy dress on their back. It's a special kind of evil that looks you in the eye and weeps for a death they caused with a pen and a bill of sale. Zebulun didn't scream. He didn't break his tools. He just sat there, holding a piece of raw leather, and watched the mistress's hem as she turned to leave. He noticed the way she stepped. She was nervous. Her weight was shifting too much. Elizabeth Thorne was a woman who lived for the high-stakes whist tables in town, and word in the quarters was that the money was running dry. The colonel, a man named Sterling who had more land than sense, was her only way out. She needed him to propose at the upcoming governor's ball, or the Thorne name was going to be scrubbed off the map by the bank. 2 days after the funeral, Elizabeth sent for Zebulun. She didn't call him to the back porch like usual. She made him come into the grand foyer, right under the crystal chandelier. She looked at him with those pale, hungry eyes and told him she needed shoes. Not just any shoes. She wanted silver silk dancing slippers, lined with the softest kidskin, with a heel that would make her glide like a ghost across the floor. She told him if they weren't the finest shoes ever seen in the South, she'd sell him down the river to a labor gang. She was desperate, and a desperate woman is a dangerous thing. Zebulun took the measurements of her feet in total silence. He felt the pulse in her ankle. It was fast, ticking like a clock. He knew she was lying about something more than just Zora. He could smell the fear on her, even through the expensive French perfume. While he was up there, the houseboy, Cato, caught his eye. Cato was a shadow in that house. He saw everything and said nothing. But that day, Cato lingered. He pointed a finger toward the mistress's private boudoir when her back was turned. Zebulun waited. He knew the rhythms of the house. He knew when the overseer went to the stables and when Elizabeth took her afternoon gin. He went back to the house under the guise of checking the floorboards where she would be practicing her steps. He found his way into her room. It was a place of silk and filth. Unpaid bills were stuffed into drawers, empty bottles were hidden under the bed, and there, tucked inside a jewelry box that was mostly empty of gold, he found a folded piece of parchment. It wasn't a death certificate. It wasn't a record of a burial. It was a bill of sale. Zora hadn't died of a fever. She had been sold to a trader headed for the deep South, a man known for buying girls for the sugar plantations where they don't live more than a year. The price was exactly what Elizabeth owed to a tavern owner in the city. Zebulun stood in that room, the paper trembling in his calloused fingers. His daughter was alive, but she was being marched into a hell that Elizabeth had paved with her own greed. He didn't take the paper. Not yet. He memorized the name of the trader. He memorized the date. Then he folded it back exactly as it was and walked out. When he got back to his shop, he didn't cry. He didn't pray. He picked up his silver awl, the sharpest tool he owned, and he began to sharpen it even more. The plan didn't come to him in a flash. It grew like a slow, cold frost. He was going to give the mistress exactly what she asked for. He was going to give her shoes that would make her the center of attention. He started the work that night. The silver silk was beautiful. It shimmered in the candlelight like moonlight on a river. To anyone else, it looked like a masterpiece in the making. But Zebulun was doing something different with the structure. Usually a dancing shoe is meant to be flexible, to move with the foot. Zebulun was building these to be a trap. He spent hours in the middle of the night, when the rest of the plantation was dead to the world, preparing the lining. He had intercepted a shipment of razors meant for the master's shaving kit a week prior. He didn't take them all, just enough. He used his grinding stone to break the steel into tiny, needle-like shards. These weren't just random pieces of metal. He was a master of his craft. He knew exactly where the pressure points of a human foot sat during a waltz. He knew where the weight shifted during a spin. He began to embed these slivers into the very fabric of the inner lining, hidden between the silk and the kidskin. The trick was the tension. If the shoes were too sharp immediately, she'd never get them on. They had to be perfect at first. They had to feel like a dream when she slipped them on in front of her mirror. But the structure was designed to fail. He used a specific type of thin, salted thread for the structural seams. As the foot heated up, as the sweat from the dance began to soak into the fabric, the salt would weaken the thread. The moment she put real force into a turn, the inner lining would shift, and the blades would begin their work. Every stitch Zebulun pulled was a memory of Zora. He thought about her laugh. He thought about the way she used to bring him water in the heat of the afternoon. And then he thought about the trader's wagon. Every time he pushed the needle through the silk, he was imagining the screams that would eventually fill the governor's ballroom. He wasn't just making shoes. He was making a confession. The overseer, a man with a face like a bruised plum, burst into the shop on the third night. He wanted to know why the lamp was still burning. Zebulun was in the middle of setting the blades into the heel of the left shoe. The light was dim, but the flash of steel was unmistakable. The overseer walked toward the bench, his heavy boots thudding on the dirt floor. Zebulun didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. As the overseer reached for the shoe, Zebulun did the only thing he could. He palmed the razor shard he was holding. He squeezed his fist shut, feeling the steel bite deep into his own palm. Blood began to seep between his fingers, dripping onto the floor, away from the silver silk. He looked up at the overseer with a face of pure, stone-cold calm. He told the man he had slipped with the awl and cut himself. He showed the bloody hand, masking the fact that he was hiding the evidence of his sabotage inside his own flesh. The overseer laughed, called him a clumsy old fool, and left him to bleed in the dark. Zebulun didn't even bandage the hand until he was sure the man was gone. He looked at the blood on his palm and then at the silver shoes. The price was being paid in advance. He knew that if he was caught, they wouldn't just kill him. They'd make him wish he was dead. But the thought of Elizabeth Thorne spinning in circles while her own cruelty cut her to the bone gave him a steady hand. He went back to work. By the end of the week, the shoes were finished. They were the most beautiful things ever created on that plantation. They glowed. They looked like they belonged on the feet of a queen. When Elizabeth came to collect them, she gasped. She didn't thank him, of course. She just snatched the box away and told him that if the colonel didn't propose, she'd have Zebulun whipped for the bloodstain she imagined she saw on the lace. Zebulun watched her walk away, carrying the box like it held her entire future. He stood in the doorway of his shack, his wounded hand hidden in his pocket. He knew the music was about to start, and he knew that once the waltz began, there would be no stopping the rhythm of what he had set in motion. The shoes were ready. The trap was set. Now all he had to do was wait for the first drop of red to hit the white ballroom floor. Elizabeth Thorne thought she had cleaned her slate by selling a child to pay for a few nights of bad cards and expensive gin. She didn't realize she had just handed the pen to a man who was ready to write her ending in red ink. She walked away from that workshop with the silver shoes in a velvet-lined box, thinking she was carrying her ticket back into high society. What she was actually carrying was a trap, designed by 30 years of calloused hands, and a heart that had been turned into flint. Zebulun watched her go, his eyes following the sway of her expensive skirts, knowing that every step she took toward the big house was a step closer to a ruin she couldn't even imagine. But the air on the thorn plantation was getting thick. You could feel it in the way the wind died down in the afternoons. The overseer, a man named Silas, who had a nose for trouble and a permanent scowl, wasn't convinced by Zebulun's story about the cut on his hand. Silas was the kind of man who didn't believe in accidents. He spent the next morning leaning against the doorframe of the workshop, chewing on a piece of hay, watching Zebulun work on a pair of mundane work boots. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched. He was looking for a slip, a nervous twitch, or the smell of a secret. Repara nisso. Tem gente que chama esse tipo de vida de tradição, mas é só crueldade escondida sob teto de luxo. Zebulun kept his head down. His palm throbbed where the razor had sliced him, but he didn't let his hand shake. He knew Silas was waiting for him to break. The problem wasn't just the overseer, though. The problem was the houseboy, Cato. Cato came down to the shop under the guise of bringing Zebulun a tin of grease, but his eyes were wide, and his breath was coming in short bursts. He whispered that the mistress was in a state of panic. The colonel had sent a messenger saying he would be arriving a day early to escort her to the governor's ball. Elspeth was spiraling, tearing through her wardrobes, demanding perfection that her bank account could no longer support. But then Cato said something that made the blood in Zebulun's veins turn to ice. He said he'd overheard the mistress talking to the trader, the man who bought Zora. The trader was still in town. He was waiting for the final payment to clear before he headed for the deep south at dawn the morning after the ball. That meant Zora was still close. She was sitting in a cage or a cellar somewhere in the city, only a few miles away, while her father sat in a shed making shoes for the woman who sold her. The clock wasn't just ticking for Elspeth's downfall anymore. It was ticking for Zora's life. Zebulun knew he had to act faster. He had the bill of sale, that folded piece of proof, but it wasn't enough to just have it. He needed it to be found in a way that Elspeth couldn't explain away. If he just handed it to the colonel, he'd be hanged before he could finish a sentence. A man in bondage has no voice in a court of law, but a piece of paper found in the wreckage of a scandal. That was different. He looked at the silver shoes sitting on the shelf in the big house, and then he looked at his tools. He had one more move to make, and it was the most dangerous one of all. That evening, Elspeth sent for him again. She wanted a final fitting. She was paranoid that the heels weren't high enough to make her stand out next to the governor's wife. Zebulun walked up to the big house, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He carried his small leather kit, and inside, hidden in a false bottom, was the bill of sale. He was ushered into her dressing room. The smell of powder and stale wine was overwhelming. Elspeth was standing there in her undergarments, looking at herself in a full-length mirror with a look of pure, hungry vanity. She stepped into the silver slippers. Zebulun knelt at her feet, his knees hitting the cold hardwood. He felt like a priest at an altar of a dead god. He reached out and adjusted the silk ribbons around her ankles. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. That heat was exactly what he needed. The salted thread he used for the structural seams was already starting to absorb the moisture from her skin. It would hold for now. It would hold through the carriage ride. It would even hold through the first slow dance. But once the tempo picked up, once she started to sweat and spin, the salt would eat the thread and the silver silk would give way to the steel. While he was pretending to tighten the heel, Zebulun saw his opening. Elspeth turned her head to bark an order at a maid, and in that split second, Zebulun slid the bill of sale out of his kit. He had hollowed out a tiny, thin compartment in the cork of the right heel, right behind the silver fabric. It was a space no bigger than a finger. He tucked the paper inside and sealed it with a dab of quick-drying resin. It was a gamble. If she felt the slight imbalance, he was a dead man. If she took a heavy step and the heel snapped too early, the secret would be out before the trap was fully set. If you don't engole esse tipo de mentira bem vestida, se inscreve. E me diz, essa prova, aquele papel escondido no salto, era aviso, ou a sentença final dela. Elspeth took a few steps around the room, She preened. She admired the way the silver caught the light. "They feel tight," she muttered, frowning at her reflection. Zebulun didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the floor. He told her that fine silk must be tight to show the shape of the foot, and that they would soften as she moved. It was a lie, and he knew she'd believe it, because her vanity wouldn't allow her to think anything was wrong with her own appearance. She wanted to believe she had the smallest, most delicate feet in the county, but Silas was still out there. When Zebulun left the big house, the overseer was waiting at the bottom of the porch steps. He grabbed Zebulun by the shoulder, his grip like a vice. He didn't ask what Zebulun was doing, he just started searching him. He patted down his pockets, tossed his leather kit onto the dirt, and kicked the tools across the yard. Silas was looking for the bill of sale. He knew Elspeth was hiding something, and he thought Zebulun was trying to steal from her. He didn't find the paper, of course, because it was already inside the shoe, but he found something else. He found a single stray shard of razor steel that had been stuck in the lining of Zebulun's pocket. Silas held the tiny sliver of metal up to the moonlight. He looked at Zebulun, and for the first time there was real fear in the old man's gut. "What's a shoemaker doing with a piece of a blade this sharp?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. Zebulun didn't blink. He said it was for paring the fine leather of the inner sole. Silas didn't believe him. He took the shard and tucked it into his own pocket. He told Zebulun that if he saw one drop of blood on the mistress's feet that wasn't hers by right, he'd skin him alive. Zebulun went back to his shop and sat in the dark. He couldn't sleep. He could hear the owls in the trees and the distant sound of a dog barking. He kept thinking about Zora. Was she cold? Was she scared? Did she think he had forgotten her? He looked at his hands, the hands that had spent a lifetime making things to protect people's feet from the world, and he realized that for the first time he had made something to let the world in. He had made a weapon out of a woman's own greed. The morning of the ball arrived with a heavy grey sky. The plantation was a hive of activity. The horses were being groomed, the carriage was being polished, and the house was filled with the screams of Elizabeth Thorne as she forced her maids to cinch her corset tighter and tighter. Zebulun was ordered to stay in his workshop. He wasn't allowed to see the departure. He was locked in from the outside, a common practice when the master and mistress were away, to ensure the assets didn't wander off. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, Zebulun watched the carriage pull up to the front of the house. He saw the colonel arrive on a white horse, looking every bit the wealthy saviour Elspeth needed. The man looked proud, rigid, and obsessed with the image of his own power. He helped Elspeth into the carriage. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue that made the silver shoes shine like stars against the dark carriage floor. She looked perfect. She looked like a lady. As the carriage started to pull away, the wheels crunching on the gravel, Zebulun felt a strange calm wash over him. The shoes were out of his hands now. The blades were set, the salt was drying, and the secret was tucked into the heel. He knew that by the time the sun came up tomorrow, the Thorne name would be a curse word in every parlor in South Carolina. But he also knew that he was a prisoner in a locked shed, and the only person who could help him find Zora was currently dancing toward a bloody disaster. If the colonel reacted the way Zebulun hoped, there would be justice. But if the colonel chose to protect Elspeth to save his own reputation, Zebulun would be executed for attempted murder, and Zora would be lost forever. The stakes were no longer just about a debt or a lie. It was a race between a father's love and a lady's pride, and the finish line was a ballroom floor that was about to become a slaughterhouse. Zebulun sat on his stool, picked up his silver awl, and waited for the music he knew he would never hear. Elizabeth Thorne walked into the governor's mansion like she was stepping onto a throne, unaware that her silver shoes were already beginning to eat her alive. Every step across that polished marble floor was a calculated move in a game of survival she thought she had already won. She had the gown, she had the colonel on her arm, and she had the perfect shoes to hide the fact that she was a bankrupt liar who had sold a child to cover a gambling debt. But what Elspeth didn't understand was the science of a man who had been pushed past his breaking point. Zebulun hadn't just made shoes. He had built a clockwork disaster that was ticking with every beat of the orchestra. The governor's ball was the kind of event where reputations were made or slaughtered under the glow of 1,000 candles. The air was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco, heavy lilies, and the sweat of people who spent their lives pretending they were better than everyone else. Colonel Sterling stood tall beside Elspeth, his uniform crisp and his ego even crisper. He looked at her not with love, but with the satisfaction of a man who had finally acquired a rare and beautiful piece of property. He didn't know that the property was mortgaged to the hilt, and that the fever that killed her houseboy's daughter was actually a bill of sale tucked inside the very heel she was standing on. Repara nisso. Tem gente que chama esse tipo de sociedade de refinada, mas por trás de cada leque de seda tem uma história de sangue que eles tentam desesperadamente esquecer. The music began, a slow, sweeping minuet that required grace and poise. Elspeth glided onto the floor, her silver slippers shimmering like fish scales under the candlelight. At first, she felt nothing but the tight, supportive hug of the silk. It was a perfect fit. Too perfect. What she didn't feel yet was the salt thread Zebulun had used for the inner seams. As her feet began to warm up from the movement, and as the natural moisture of her skin began to seep into the kidskin lining, the salt started its work. It was a chemical reaction, slow and invisible, eating away at the structural integrity of the shoes from the inside out. But then there was Sella. Sella was the head laundress from the Thorne estate, brought along to the mansion to assist the ladies in the powder room. She was a woman who knew the weight of a secret, because she had spent her life washing the stains out of them. As Elspeth passed by on her way to the dance floor, Sella noticed something. She noticed the way the silver silk seemed to be pulling at a strange angle. She noticed a tiny, dark speck on the floor where Elspeth had just stepped. It wasn't mud. It was too dark, too thick. Sella didn't say a word. She just watched, her eyes narrowing as she realized that the shoemaker's silence in the workshop hadn't been grief. It had been a countdown. The first blow to Elspeth's composure came during the second dance. The tempo had increased. The colonel was a vigorous dancer, spinning her with a force that sent her skirts flying. That was when she felt it, a sharp, hot sting on the ball of her right foot. It was tiny, like a bee sting, but it didn't go away. She smiled through it, tilting her head back to laugh at one of the colonel's dry jokes. She couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not when the engagement was so close to being announced. But the sting turned into a slice. Then another. Inside the shoe, the layers of silk and kidskin were starting to shift. The tension of the salted thread had snapped in 3 key places. This allowed the hidden razor fragments to pivot. Every time she put her weight down, the steel didn't just press into her skin. It moved. It soared. Zebulun had positioned them so that the centrifugal force of a waltz would drive the blades deeper into the soft arch of her foot. The colonel noticed her stumble. It was a small thing, a hitch in her step that lasted less than a second. He frowned, his grip on her hand tightening. "Are you quite well, Elspeth?" he asked, his voice like cold gravel. He didn't like imperfection. He didn't like anything that made him look less than masterful on the dance floor. Elspeth gasped out a yes, her face pale under her rouge. She could feel something wet inside her shoe now. It was warm. It was spreading, and with every step, the silver silk was becoming heavier, soaked with a fluid that was starting to ruin the very masterpiece Zebulun had created. "If you don't engole esse tipo de luxo construído sobre a dor alheia", se inscreve. E me diz, você acha que a Elspeth começou a sentir o peso do que fez com a Zora, ou ela só estava preocupada com o vestido manchado? The situation was worsening by the minute. The ballroom was getting hotter. The candles were melting, and so was Elspeth's resolve. She tried to suggest they sit out the next dance, but the governor himself approached, requesting the honor. You don't say no to the governor. She was trapped. She had to stand. She had to smile. She had to dance. As she moved from the colonel's arms to the governor's, she felt a sickening squelch inside her right slipper. The silver silk, once pristine and bright, was starting to take on a dull, bruised color near the sole. In the powder room, Sella was folding towels when she heard the first murmur of gossip. A young debutante came in, whispering to her friend about the strange smell on the dance floor. It wasn't the smell of perfume or sweat. It was the metallic, sharp scent of fresh copper. Zora felt a shiver go down her spine. She knew that smell. She had smelled it in the infirmary. She had smelled it when the overseer used his whip. She realized then that Zebulun hadn't just targeted Elspeth's feet. He had targeted her public mask. The turning point came during the Waltz of the Roses. It was the centerpiece of the evening. The floor was cleared for the most prominent couples. Elspeth was at the center of the circle. The music was fast, a whirlwind of violins and flutes. She was spinning, her midnight blue gown blooming around her. But inside the shoes, the disaster was complete. The blades had carved through the kidskin lining entirely. They were now resting against the bone. Every time she spun, the pressure forced the blood upward, through the fibers of the silver silk. It wasn't just a speck anymore. A dark, jagged ring of crimson was rising from the sole of her shoe, climbing up the silver fabric like a rising tide. The guests at the edge of the circle started to point. The music seemed to grow louder, mocking her. She looked at the colonel, seeking help, but he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the floor. There, on the white-painted wood of the governor's ballroom, were the tracks, red wet crescents. Every time Elspeth stepped, she left a signature of her own destruction. She tried to stop, to limp toward the chairs, but the governor held her firm, unaware or perhaps too traditional to break the pattern of the dance. He whirled her around one last time, and that was when the right heel, the one holding the secret, hit an uneven plank in the floor. The structural thread gave way entirely. The heel didn't just break, it shattered. The resin Zebulun had used to seal the hidden compartment snapped like glass. Elspeth's ankle buckled and she went down hard, her silk skirts tangling around her legs. The music screeched to a halt as the violinists saw the mistress of Thorne plantation sprawled on the floor, her face twisted in a scream that was no longer a lady's whisper. The colonel stepped back. He didn't reach down to help her. He didn't offer a hand. He saw the blood. He saw the silver shoe, now almost entirely red, lying a few feet away from her mangled foot. And there, resting in the middle of the red puddle, was a small folded piece of parchment that had fallen out of the hollowed heel. It was white, stained only at the edges, and it looked like a small, accusing ghost sitting on the ballroom floor. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was Elspeth's ragged breathing and the drip of something hitting the wood. The governor reached down and picked up the paper. He didn't know what it was. He thought it might be a love note or a piece of the shoe's construction, but as he unfolded it, his eyes widened. He was a man of the law, and he recognized a bill of sale when he saw one. He recognized the official seal of the state trader. Elspeth reached out, her fingers clawing at the air, trying to grab the paper. "It's nothing," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's a mistake. My feet. Someone poisoned my shoes." But the damage was done. The colonel moved closer, his eyes fixed on the paper in the governor's hand. He read the name of the girl. He read the price. He read the date, the same date Elspeth had told him she was mourning the loss of a loyal servant. The mask hadn't just slipped. It had been shredded. The silver shoes, the symbol of her status and her bridge to a new life, were now the evidence of her crime. Zebulun had known that the pain would make her fall, but he also knew that the fall would reveal the truth. He had turned her vanity into a spotlight that was now shining directly on her darkest sin. Subscribe. Aqui a gente puxa o que tentaram enterrar e mostra que a justiça às vezes vem em passos lentos, mas vem. E comenta. Você acha que o coronel se afastou por nojo do crime? Ou por medo de ser associado à falência dela? Elizabeth Thorne lay on the floor, a broken woman in a ruined dress, surrounded by the very people she had tried so hard to impress. The silver shoes were gone, replaced by a reality that was far sharper than any blade. She looked up and saw Zora standing in the doorway, watching her with a face that held no pity. She saw the governor hand the bill of sale to the colonel, and she knew, as the first sob finally broke from her throat, that the dance was over. But for Zebulun, sitting in his dark workshop miles away, the real work was just beginning. He had the name, he had the trader, and now he had the chaos he needed to go find his daughter. The silver shoe lay in a pool of blood on the governor's white-painted floor, but the piece of paper resting next to it was the real weapon. Elizabeth Thorne had sold a child to buy a lie, and now that lie was screaming in the middle of a silent ballroom. What Elspeth didn't know as she clutched her mangled foot and looked into the cold eyes of the man she intended to marry was that the trap hadn't just closed on her body. It had closed on her life. The mask of the Southern lady wasn't just slipping, it was being torn away by the very silver silk she thought would save her. Colonel Sterling didn't move to help her. He was a man who built his entire existence on the granite foundation of his reputation. Seeing Elspeth on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of her own cruelty and insolvency, was like watching a beautiful house collapse into the mud. He reached down, his white-gloved hand steady, and snatched the bill of sale from the governor's fingers. He read it once. Then he read it again. His face didn't turn red with anger. It turned a pale, sickly grey. Notice this. Some people call this kind of honor sacred, but it's just a pretty name they use to hide a lack of character and a mountain of debt. The governor called for a doctor, but the room stayed back. No one wanted to be near the woman who had turned a ball into a butcher shop. Elspeth was babbling now, her voice high and thin. She pointed a shaking finger at the shoe, then at the door. She tried to say that the shoemaker had poisoned her, that the slaves were revolting, that it was all a conspiracy to steal her land. But the blood on the floor didn't lie. And the name on that bill of sale, Zora, matched the name of the girl she had claimed died of a fever just weeks ago. In the high-stakes world of South Carolina society, a lie about money was bad, but a lie that exposed you as a bankrupt fraud was a social death sentence. While the elite was staring in horror, things were moving fast back at the Thorne plantation. Silas, the overseer, had seen the carriage of a local magistrate pulling up to the main gates. News travels fast when a woman's credit runs out. He knew the bank was finally coming for the land, the house, and the people. Silas wasn't worried about Elspeth. He was worried about himself. He had that razor shard in his pocket, and he knew that if the shoemaker talked, Silas would be the one holding the bag for Elspeth's crimes. Silas marched toward the locked workshop, his heavy boots kicking up dust in the moonlight. He had his heavy leather whip in one hand and a pistol in the other. He intended to end Zebulun before the law could question him. He reached the door and fumbled with the heavy iron padlock. "Old man," he roared, "you think you're clever? You think those shoes are going to save you?" But when the door swung open, the workshop was silent. The small room smelled of leather and oil, but the stool was empty. Silas stepped inside, his lantern swinging wildly. He didn't see the shadow moving behind the door. He didn't see the houseboy, Cato, who had stolen the spare key from the kitchen hours ago. And he certainly didn't see Zebulun, who was standing in the corner with the silver awl, the sharpest tool in his kit, held tight in his calloused hand. Zebulun didn't wait for Silas to turn around. He didn't say a word. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years cutting through the toughest hides. The awl found its mark, not to kill, but to disable. Silas went down with a grunt, the pistol skittering across the dirt floor. Zebulun stepped over him, his face as calm as a frozen lake. He didn't take the money from Silas's belt. He didn't take the whip. He took the name of the trader he had memorized from the bill of sale, and he took a horse from the stables. "If you don't swallow this kind of high society rot, subscribe. And tell me, do you think the shoemaker's blade was a crime, or was it the only law that actually worked in a place like this?" By the time Zebulun reached the city limits, the sun was starting to bleed over the horizon. He rode straight for the trader's yard near the docks. He could see the wagons being loaded. He could hear the clink of chains and the low, miserable murmurs of people who were being prepared for the journey to the deep south. His heart was a hammer in his chest. He looked for the trader, a man with a red face and a hat pulled low over his eyes. The trader was arguing with a group of men in uniform. It wasn't the police. It was the colonel's men. Colonel Sterling hadn't gone home to sleep. He had gone to the city to scrub his hands of Elspeth Thorne. He knew that if he could prove the sale of Zora was illegal, that the girl was actually part of a protected estate under lien from the bank, he could use that to seize the Thorne assets himself and pay off the debts Elspeth owed him. It wasn't about justice for Zora. It was about the colonel getting his money back. Zebulun watched from the shadows as the colonel's lawyer handed over a stack of papers. The trader grumbled, spit on the ground, and pointed toward the back of a covered wagon. A girl was led out. She was thin, her dress was torn, and she looked like she had seen the end of the world. It was Zora. She was alive. Zebulun didn't wait for the lawyers to finish their talk. He walked out into the light of the rising sun. The colonel saw him. The two men looked at each other, the master of land and the master of leather. The colonel knew exactly what Zebulun had done with those silver shoes. He could see the dried blood on Zebulun's hands. For a moment, the world stood still. The colonel could have called for the guards. He could have had Zebulun hanged for what happened in that ballroom. But the colonel was a practical man. If he hanged the shoemaker, he'd lose the most valuable craftsman in the state. And more importantly, if Zebulun went to trial, the whole story of Elspeth's bankruptcy and the colonel's own involvement with her would stay in the newspapers for months. He needed this to go away. He looked at Zora, then back at Zebulun. "Take the girl," the colonel said, his voice cold and empty. "Get off my sight. If I see either of you on Thorne land again, I'll finish what the mistress started." Zebulun didn't say thank you. He didn't bow. He walked over to his daughter, took her hand in his and felt her grip tighten until her knuckles were white. They didn't look back. They walked toward the docks, toward a different life, toward a place where their names wouldn't be written on a bill of sale. Back at the mansion, the end was much uglier. Elspeth Thorne was never the same. The blades had done permanent damage to the tendons in her feet. She would never walk without a heavy, agonizing limp. But the social damage was worse. The bank seized the house 3 days later. Every piece of furniture, every silk dress, and every bottle of gin was sold at auction on the front lawn. The mistress was forced to move into a small, damp room in the city, living on the charity of relatives who despised her. The colonel never spoke her name again. He married a woman with a boring face and a massive dowry, and he spent the rest of his life pretending the night of the governor's ball never happened. But every time he saw a pair of silver shoes in a shop window, he felt a phantom pain in his own feet. He knew that somewhere out there, a man with calloused hands was still holding a silver awl, and that the truth has a way of cutting through even the thickest silk. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury and show that the powerful are only as strong as the lies they tell themselves. And comment. Do you think Zebulun's justice was enough, or was the colonel just as guilty for letting it all happen? The Thorne plantation eventually grew over with weeds. The white paint peeled, the roof sagged, and the jasmine was choked out by the rot. People say that if you walk near the old workshop at night, you can still hear the sound of a sharpening stone. They say it's the sound of a man making sure that the next time a lady wants to dance on someone's heart, she'll have to pay the price in blood. Because in the end, a vanity that demands perfection eventually bleeds out. And the man who handles the leather always knows exactly where the seams will break. The shoes were made to the exact measure of your heart, mistress, and your heart was always full of blades.